Welcome everyone. This is Deb Brucker from the University of New Hampshire's Institute on Disability. We're glad you've joined us today. Next slide. As an introduction, the National Trends in Disability Employment nTIDE Lunch and Learn occurs at noon Eastern on the day that the nTIDE report is released. The nTIDE Lunch and Learn is a joint effort of the UNH Institute on Disability, Kessler Foundation, and the Association of University Centers on Disability, AUCD. The nTIDE Lunch and Learn is part of the Rehabilitation and Research Training Center on Employment Policy and Measurement, which is funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, NIDLR. Next. Our agenda for today, we start with an update on our nTIDE monthly report. John O'Neill from Kessler Foundation and myself will provide the numbers. Part 2 is nTIDE News. Denise Rozelle from the Association of University Centers on Disabilities will give updates from the field of disability employment and let us know what's happening on the Hill. And we're very honored to have guest speakers, Lisa Ottamanelli from the Veterans Administration and an interviewee from the field, Timothy Myers, who is also at the VA. We'll have Q&A for all parts of the program at the end. Next. I'd like to turn it over to John O'Neill.
Thank you, Deb. I'm going to give some background on the nTIDE report. Next slide, please. The nTIDE report is a monthly press release and infographic that looks at the latest employment statistics. It uses data from the jobs report released by the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics on the first Friday of each month. This is an effort, nTIDE is an effort, a joint effort between the Kessler Foundation and the University of New Hampshire. Next slide, please. The source of the data is the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, their current population survey, otherwise known as the CPS. It is the source of the official unemployment rate that the media makes such, pays such great attention to on the first Friday of each month. It's data on civilians not living in institutions between the ages of 16 and 64. And this information has been available since September 2008 onward. That was the year that the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics added the 6 disability questions. It is not yet seasonally adjusted, this information. That's why we compare the current month to the same month last year. Okay, Deb, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, John. Next slide. So we saw an increase this month compared to the same month last year in the employment to population ratio for people with disabilities and people without disabilities. For people with disabilities, the employment to population ratio increased to 31.4%. That ratio remains much higher for people without disabilities at 74.3%. Next slide. The labor force participation rate, which shows the percent of people either employed or actively looking for work, also increased for both groups of people compared to this time last year. For people with disabilities, this raised to 34.2%. And for people without disabilities, this raised to 76.9%. Next slide. So this continues an upward trend we've been seeing in the employment to population ratio for people with disabilities, although there still remains a large gap, as you can see, between the bottom lines and the top line, which indicates people without disabilities. The bottom line is people with disabilities. So there's still about a 40 percentage point difference between the employment to population ratio between these two groups. Next slide. So we'd like to, for the next couple of months, get your feedback about what's working and what topics you would like to see in our monthly webcast. So we're going to pop up a poll for those of you who are watching via Zoom. If you're joining via Facebook Live, you can click the chat icon and type in your response. We'd like to know what topics you'd like to have discussed in an upcoming Lunch and Learn webinar. These include long-term services and supports, veterans in employment, which actually we're touching on today, youth transition, disability and poverty, technology, media and the arts, research and training, business and employment, advocacy, health and benefit planning. If there are other areas that we didn't list, feel free to reach out as well. Karen, if you could please share the poll. Okay, I think we're having some technical difficulties with the poll, but if you have thoughts about this, you can use our email address that we provide at the end to share your thoughts about what we'd like to see in upcoming webcasts. Next slide. So I'll turn it over to Denise Roselle to talk about nTIDE news.
Got to unmute. Hi, everybody. It's Denise Roselle from AUCD. Why don't we go to the next slide? Let's talk. Federal policy update is the first thing we're going to look at. I'm sure every one of you out there knows that there is an election on Tuesday. I hope you do. And to the extent that I can influence you, go vote. That's the only message I've got. Go vote. It's important. Next, after that election on Tuesday, the Congress, the Senate and the House are both out now, and they will be coming back, and we'll have a lame duck session after that. There are a number of things that are going to come up in that lame duck session that you should be aware of. The first one, money follows the person. We've talked about this a number of times recently. For those of you who are particularly interested in money follows, we still think that may come up in the lame duck session. So continue your messages to your members of Congress about how important money follows is. As you probably remember, it expired basically a year ago or so. We're looking to try to re-energize it. As we understand it right now, at least, what's going to come up is just one, yes, Deb, I can do that, is just one one-year extension, but that's better than what we've got right now. Deb Brucker just sent me a quick note to say I should explain what a lame duck is. What a lame duck session means is that the existing Congress, those who have been in power before the election, come back in and continue to work between right after the election and when the new Congress is sworn in, which is usually January. So it means that the old guys and girls and women, whatever, come back, the existing Congress, and then the new Congress, those who are being elected on Tuesday, get sworn in January, and they become the new Congress. So lame duck means just that the leftover guys are coming back. So they're going to try and get some work done, particularly since it looks like, or people are thinking that there might be some changes in how Congress looks when they're sworn in January. So money follows the person is one. Something that's likely to take up a lot of oxygen in Washington and may keep other things from being raised. The president is still working on trying to get money for the wall across the southern border. There's going to be a lot of talk about that. Some of the budget still needs to be approved, the appropriations bills, et cetera. The defense is done, and actually the ones that affect the programs that we care most about, that would be the education, health education, and labor budget. Those are all done, but there are some of the budget pieces that are not out there. Okay, I'm already telling me to speak up, so I'm both turning up my volume and speaking up. Okay, so they need to finish the budget. The other thing that might take up a lot of oxygen that they're beginning to talk about here in DC a lot is that we may have some cabinet officials who leave, and then, for instance, the Attorney General, and then the existing Congress, that is the lame duck Congress, would try to vote in a replacement before the new Congress takes over. If that and the wall and the budget all happen, then other stuff is not likely to happen, and that creates some conflicts for money follows the person and for some other things. The Farm Bill is likely to come up, which includes the food stamp program and the move to include work requirements in the food stamp program. We're anticipating they may try and bring that up during the lame duck session as well. But again, if we're talking wall, budget, and a new attorney general, very little else may actually happen. Okay, so that's the budget. That's the lame duck regulations. I need to be saying one thing. We talked a little bit about this last time, and there are 3 things you should be aware of. One, we've talked about it a number of times that we think there's going to be WIOA regulations, that they're going to open up the WIOA regulations and really look at those again. We thought that would happen by now. It hasn't. It looks now like it'll be sometime after the first of the year in January or into the spring. So be on the lookout for that. There's also some talk now about a change in regulations on non-emergency medical transportation under Medicaid, that it would change that non-emergency medical transportation from being a requirement under Medicaid to being an option. If that happens, that could have an impact on, certainly on people with disabilities, but it could have an impact on some of the employment issues that we talk about, depending on the state and how their Medicaid works in the state. That's all very state-based. And lastly, public charge. We touched on this last time. The best thing to tell you about public charge is if someone is what they call public charge, that is, they are using services, they are a quote, alien, unquote, that's the statutory language. They are an immigrant who is trying to stay in the United States, and they are using, they are a quote, public charge, that is, they are depending on services within the United States. They can be denied for that reason from being able to stay. In the past, there are only certain services that fit under that definition that they can use. This administration is trying to increase what those services would be, so that if you are dependent on SNAP, that is food stamps, if you're dependent on housing assistance like public housing, if you're dependent on Medicaid, if you're dependent on, and they're asking about what to do about CHIP, that is the Children's Health Insurance Program. All of those things, if you are using those, the administration would like to be able to use that to say that you are a public charge and you should not be able to stay in the country. There's lots more information about this, and I would definitely send you to the AUCD website. We have a plain language explanation of it. We have a way there that you can send comments, because what they're actually doing now is asking for comments from the public on this proposed regulation. So we have a plain language explanation. We have a way you can submit comments automatically with some draft comments you can use. There's other explanations of what this means. Go to the AUCD.org website, search public charge if this is something that you're particularly interested in. It's complicated, but it really could, as you can see, for people with disabilities who use Medicaid, that could be a huge issue, or for families, excuse me, who potentially have a parent or a child with a disability that are using Medicaid and are using public benefits. Could really impact their ability to stay, and or the flip of that is impact how much they use those public benefits, which in turn cause more problems. What can you be doing now? Again, vote. That would be the most important part. Okay, next slide. The things I have to highlight beyond the federal policy this month are things that are generally not disability-specific publications, but that have some very specific applicability if you think about it. CLASP has a new publication out called Maximizing the Power of Career Pathways. It is not specifically targeted to disability, but it has some really good information about career pathway research, what does and doesn't work. And this is something clearly that we are all talking about in this field right now. What are, or if we aren't, we should be, career pathways, and how do we make sure that people with disabilities can be involved in career pathways, that is moving along in particular careers. And as my friend Liz Weintraub says, not just looking at jobs, but looking at careers. So what does and doesn't work, what components are essential to a model, what questions need more research, summary of additional recent studies. There's some really good information in here. So I send that one to you. Next slide. Another one that's just come is, this is a little bit more specific. This is employers' perspectives on accommodating and retaining employees with newly acquired disabilities. It's in the new Journal of Occupational Rehab. It's based on some mathematical research. You can see, they did very structured interviews with HR managers, And I think that specifically in Arkansas, so it's a very targeted conversation they have, but I think interesting, and I think to the extent that we can copy this in other places, it would be fascinating. Key factors affecting accommodation and retention, none of these are surprises. Employers' access to resources, ease and difficulty of communication with the employee, characteristics of the employee, tenure, health condition, that kind of stuff. But because they're interviews with HR managers, I really found them fascinating. So I would definitely recommend this one to you as well. Next slide. This is another one that's a disability generic. It is not disability, it is more generic, but clearly applies. This is from the Urban Institute, and it has to do with measuring employment outcomes in TANF. So for those of you who are involved in TANF programs, this is an interesting one. And as I said, it looks at unintended consequences, and I think that's part of what's made it really interesting. So this is another generic one that I think applies, though, within the disability world. Next slide. There we go. The National Governors Association. This is another one where those of us who are on the phone in the field probably are not going to see anything you don't already know in this document. However, it is from the National Governors Association. It's tied in as part of the partnership with ODEP, National Council of State Legislatures, called SEED, the SEED Project, which we had a speaker who spoke to us on the nTIDE Luncheon a couple of months ago about SEED. And SEED is specifically trying to help states expand their employment and training to people with disabilities. And this is something that's come out from NGA. The reason I'm saying it to you, even though it's not going to have new information probably for most people on this call, this is a great document to use to take with you to a meeting with your governor, to a meeting with your administration, whether it's your Medicaid office, your employment office, your Department of Labor in the state, whoever. This is a great document to take with you and use in that situation because it's from NGA. It is nonpartisan. It is, and it's from the governors. It's a good one, and I really recommend you use it. Next slide. I'm running a little over time. I want to get through this. This one is Career and Tech Ed. This one also is very interesting, not so much because of what it tells you, but because of what it says we don't know. It's looking at tech ed on career and technical education for students with disabilities. And it really says, you know, we haven't done enough work in this area. And as I've talked with you all about, there have been changes in the Perkins bill that passed last year that use that improve career and technical education opportunities for people with disabilities. This actually shows that we need more of this. So this is another one. If you're trying to leverage what you learned in what we've changed in Perkins by what we need to know about career and technical ed for students with disabilities, this is a great one to use. It's just out in the Journal of Disability Policy Studies. Tom Hare, who was at the Department of Education in OSERS, is one of the authors on this, uses Massachusetts data, shows basically, you know, the importance of career and technical education, also talks about what more we need to be doing. Another really good one to look at. Next slide. I know I'm running out of my time, so I'm out of my time. So I want to give you a couple of others. This one's an info brief. I'm not going to talk much about it. There's a link there. Go look at it. It talks about professional development for folks who are providing youth services. And I don't know about you, but I hear this all the time, that that there aren't enough people who really understand the difference in how to provide services to youth as opposed to services to any other adult. So we need more work in this area. This is a great one, got lots of links. Next slide. This is awesome. The Crip, the Fat, and the Ugly in an Age of Austerity. Go look at this. It's a special forum in review of Disability Studies Journal, the Disability Studies Journal. It's all about intersectionality. And I love the title besides, but it's fabulous. Next slide. I think I'm done. The ABLE webinars, we did these. If you need more information on ABLE, these were originally broadcast in October. They're now up online. So you can go to the AUCD website. If you search on ABLE or on the titles of these webinars, the stuff is up there. They're done by the Association of Treasurers, the State Association of Treasurers. So they're really good, and they're not necessarily done by one of the disability organizations, which I think is also, frankly, a good thing. Will take you a long ways. another really good resource. Next slide. There we go. And save the date for the State of the Science. You all know about that. If not, here it is. Here's a link. We're good. Thank you. I went over a little bit, so I'm going to toss back to, I think John is going to introduce our speaker next, perhaps. So am I tossing back to you, John?
Thank you, Denise. Yeah, I'm going to introduce Dr. Atamanelli. She's a clinical psychologist at the James A. Healy Veterans Hospital and associate professor in the Department of Rehabilitation and Mental Health Counseling, University of South Florida in Tampa. Her research focuses on the implementation and evaluation of evidence-based practices to restore employment and community integration of veterans with spinal cord injury and other physical disabilities. Lisa, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, John, and thank you for inviting me to speak about individual placement and support in spinal cord injury and the VA system of care. Next slide. As we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that this discussion will contain material work based on work supported by the Rehabilitation Research and Development Service through 2 service-directed grants, as well as private grant money through the Craig H. Nielsen Foundation, though the contents do not necessarily represent the views of the Department of Veterans Affairs or the United States government. I'm going to speak a little bit about the research that we've done in this area and what we've learned, and then I'll be inviting Mr. Myers to join the discussion and talk about his experience in supported employment and working at the VA. Next slide, please. I'd like to say a word or two about our VA spinal cord injury and disorder system of care. The VA SCID system of care is designed around a hub and spoke system. The 25 SCID centers are the hubs. The newest one is Denver, but not yet pictured on the map that's being shown. Each hub has a highly trained and experienced interdisciplinary team of providers, including doctors, nurses, psychologists, social workers, therapists, and others, who can deal with the unique problems and complications and comorbidities that face people with a spinal cord injury or disorder. The SCID system of care is the largest integrated system of care for persons with spinal cord injury in the world, actually. Next slide, please. In way of an example, the SCID continuum of care includes a variety of services from acute care and SCI rehabilitation to preventative care, sustaining care, including medical and surgical treatment of conditions related to spinal cord injury and disorders. It includes both inpatient and outpatient care, as well as an array of extended care services throughout the lifetime. These include programs like spinal cord injury home care, telehealth care, and even respite care. Now you'll note on the slide that vocational rehabilitation is listed, and vocational rehabilitation has long been considered an important part of spinal cord injury rehabilitation, but until recently, we didn't have good information about the most effective ways to provide vocational rehabilitation for persons with spinal cord injury. Next slide, please. In fact, 2 recently published systematic reviews commented on the profound lack of interventional studies in the area of employment and spinal cord injury. And they cited that the strongest evidence for an effective vocational intervention in spinal cord injury is the randomized controlled trial on individual placement and support, IPS, supported employment, that was conducted in the VA system of care. Next slide. The Spinal Cord Injury Vocational Integration Study, as it was called, or SCI-VIP, was conducted from 2010 to 2015. There are a couple of interesting features of this study. First, if you will, this was the first control study of vocational interventions in spinal cord injury. So it was the first time that vocational rehabilitation had been studied in this population. It was also the first study of IPS in a population of persons with a primary physical disability. As you know or may know, IPS was developed in the mental health field, and there's a robust body of literature on using IPS and its effectiveness among persons with mental illness. Well, this particular study tested whether IPS was better than the usual vocational approach for improving employment in the area of spinal cord injury. Next slide. IPS is an evidence-based model of supported employment. It's a well-defined clinical model of individualized job placement and support services closely aligned with clinical care to help people with significant disabilities achieve employment. IPS is based on 8 foundational principles, and I'll refer viewers back to the 2 previous webinars where the founder of IPS spoke, Debbie Becker, about IPS development and use, as well as Sally Rogers most recently on last month's webinar. But I do want to highlight, next slide please, how introducing IPS into spinal cord injury care involved a significant paradigm shift for us. Conventional models of vocational rehabilitation and SCI meant that we referred individuals for vocational rehabilitation after their spinal cord injury rehabilitation was completed. What this meant was that there was little or no connection between the healthcare team that was managing and treating their spinal cord injury and those who were providing vocational rehabilitation. Most of the time, conventional rehabilitation involves stepwise approaches, things like independent living skills, skills training, pre-vocational training, or transitional employment settings. Introducing IPS into the SCID system of care meant employment services would now be delivered concurrent with SCI rehabilitation and medical care. This was a more integrated model of care. So instead of spending a lot of time with pre-vocational activities, testing, or counseling, the IPS model meant that we were asking providers and their teams to rapidly engage people in finding competitive employment in the community based on their preferences through job development and other community-based services. We tested this model for 12 months at 6 spinal cord injury centers. At some spinal cord injury centers, the model was introduced and veterans with spinal cord injury were randomized either to receive conventional vocational rehabilitation or IPS. And then there are a couple other centers that participated by sharing observational data where the model was not introduced at all. Next slide. You can see on this slide that the results showed that IPS was superior to conventional vocational rehabilitation in the SCI centers where veterans were randomized to receive either IPS or conventional vocational rehabilitation. Persons who received IPS were significantly more likely to obtain a paying job in the community. In fact, they were 2.5 times more likely to obtain a paying job than those who were randomized to receive the conventional vocational rehabilitation approach. When we looked at persons who were randomized to receive IPS compared to those who we just observed at centers where it was not even introduced into the center, the results were even more dramatic. People who received IPS were more than 10 times more likely than those to get a paying job in the community. So the randomized trial showed us that IPS was indeed effective in restoring employment outcomes in the area of spinal cord injury. Next slide, please. We followed that up with the predictive model over time to employment study, or PROMOTE, which was conducted from 2010 to 2015. The aims of this study was to look at whether a 24-month program of IPS could increase the employment rate and improve IPS program implementation. And we also were able to look at the impact on healthcare utilization. For the remainder of our discussion today, I'm going to focus on the employment rate outcomes and quality of life changes, as well as what we learned from talking to our providers about best practices for implementation. Next slide, please. I'd like to talk with you a little bit about the participants who were in our PROMOTE study. 3/4 of them were outpatients, although we did also enroll people who were in the hospital at the time as inpatients. There are a wide range of functional impairments represented among our sample. We had people with paraplegia as well as people with tetraplegia, what was formerly referred to as quadriplegia, with different levels of severity of their injuries as well. We had some individuals that had no movement or sensation below their level of injury. We also had people who had some degree of preserved movement or sensation. What this meant essentially was that we had individuals that were using power wheelchairs, even a few individuals who were on ventilators, and then we had individuals who were using manual wheelchairs and some who were ambulating with assistive devices like walkers or canes. Like the typical spinal cord injury population, half of our population had a history of traumatic brain injury, and they had some of the common mental health conditions that are typically seen among individuals with spinal cord injury, such as depression and substance abuse. So the bottom line here is that the people who enrolled in Promote in the VA with spinal cord injury were representative of the typical patients that we treat in the SCID system of care. This is important because we really sought to follow the IPS principle of zero exclusion. That is, we enrolled anyone who wanted to go back to work based simply on their desire to do so. Didn't exclude people based on the level of severity of their injury or other comorbidities or complications. Next slide, please. So despite the level of impairments and the comorbidities reflected, in the Promote trial, 43.2% of our veterans achieved an employment outcome. Most worked part-time in line with their preferences, though a few worked full-time. They worked in a wide variety of jobs and settings, including jobs in the community. Reflected in the slide is a gentleman who is teaching Japanese students English via Skype. We had teachers at all levels, from kindergarten through preschool. We had gentlemen and ladies that worked in fields ranging from engineering, mechanics, craftsmen, and others. Jobs were developed around their unique abilities, limitations, preferences, and desires. We had some individuals who pursued a path of self-employment, either because they wanted to work at home or they wanted to start their own business. And then, like Mr. Myers, we had some individuals that wanted to work at the VA. And they worked in a variety of settings in the VA, from clinical services to education to administration. Next slide, please. Through objective measures, as well as interviews with our veterans, we learned that they experienced quality of life changes resulting from going back to work. They experienced improvements in mobility, productivity, and social participation. The quotes you see here are reflective of what they told us. They talked about not being bored anymore, not having to sit around at home. They talked about getting out and interacting with people being rewarding. And then I'll read the quote on the bottom because it reflects a lot of what we heard from people about contributing to society. I think supported employment has brought a lot of pride to me. I can show my kids just because I am paralyzed doesn't mean my life ends. It's not about the money. It's obviously, it's about being able to contribute and give something back. Next slide, please. We also went back and looked at how our vocational providers were spending their time during the time that they were delivering IPS. We did this by looking at their notes in the electronic medical record. So when we found that our providers were spending more time delivering what could be considered traditional models of vocational rehabilitation, spending time on office-based types of activities like interviewing, assessment, and counseling, their clients were less likely to get a job. However, when they spent more time using the IPS-oriented integrated service model, delivering services in the community like job development, job placement, and follow-along supports, those veterans were more likely to get a job. Next slide, please. We talked to a lot of our providers as well as leadership about what helped implement IPS in the VA system of care. Critical to integration of vocational and clinical services is that everyone with a primary responsibility for a veteran's care is engaged and involved with ensuring that employment is considered part of overall rehabilitation. They told us that effective collaboration between vocational and clinical providers requires deliberate actions and a top-down commitment from leadership to establish employment as a standard goal of rehabilitation after spinal cord injury. Next slide. Next slide, thank you. The VA has recognized evidence-based supported employment as a best care anywhere in its recent publication of Best Care Everywhere. I'll let Mr. Myers respond to that. Next slide, please. In order to help our providers provide this model of care, through the Craig H. Nielsen Foundation, we were able to develop a toolkit for rehabilitation professionals who wish to use IPS in SCID centers. This toolkit is currently available in version 1 online, and we're grateful through the Craig H. Nielsen Foundation. We're going to continue to refine the toolkit because we've partnered with the colleagues at the Hines VA Spinal Cord Injury Center and the vocational service there to give us feedback through a field test of the kit, and we'll be able to improve it and offer version 2, hopefully, in the next coming years. Next slide. There are lots of people that contributed to this ongoing work through the years, but I particularly want to thank our veterans who taught us that work is for everybody. And so at this juncture, let me turn and introduce you to Mr. Tim Myers. Tim is a Navy veteran with us who participated in the Promote project. And I'd like, if you could share with us a little bit about your disability so the audience could get to know you a little bit, that would be wonderful.
Okay. Hello? Yes. All right, thank you.
Tim is actually at work today, who's taking his lunch hour to contribute to this webinar, so we're grateful for that.
Okay, I was injured in a motorcycle accident in 2006. I was launched off my bike and I landed face first at 85 miles an hour. Face first, I snapped my head back at spinal cord compression C4, 5, and 6. They brought me to the VA hospital. I spent 10 months here getting me put back together. And I went home and I didn't do anything. I had therapy and I'd come back and forth to the VA. And then after my therapy, I didn't do anything and I started to get depression. So I talked to Rachel Amata had gotten a hold of me, and she had a Promote study going on. And we tried to do a couple jobs, and I wasn't able to do any of them. And I kind of gave up on it. So then I got depression again, and I came in here, and the doctor told me that I needed to get a job. And Rachel got a hold of me again, and she said, I have a job opening that you'd be perfect for. She said it's delivering medications for the inpatient pharmacy in the hospital. So I jumped on it, and I've been here now 4 years doing it.
That's wonderful. Can you tell us exactly how did Rachel, your vocational provider, help you obtain that job?
Well, it was an opening, and she gathered the openings that were available. And there was a girl there working that was in a wheelchair, and she was working part-time, and what they had set up was 2 people in wheelchairs working part-time. I worked 3 days, and then 1 week she'd work 3, and then we'd work 2 back and forth. So they fired her because issues that I'm sure what happened. And they came to me and they asked me if I would like to go full-time because they liked my work. So I accepted it, and here we are.
And here you are working full-time. So you also mentioned that there were some other people involved, your doctor specifically.
Yeah, my doctor, my occupational therapist, and my physical therapist all got together. And when I applied for the job, I had to go around and see if I could do it. And there were a lot of barriers that I couldn't overcome, like getting in the door with my PIV card, my ID card. And as I went around and we saw the issues, my therapist would take note of it, and they said, we'll work on this and see what we can do.
And so what did they do to address those issues where you couldn't get in the door, and the PIV card, which is the ID cards we use at the VA to get in the door?
What they did is they made, it's a, I don't know if you can see this, it's a Velcro with plastic that's molded, and it's on the front of it, is Velcro, and they put Velcro on the back of my ID card. So I just take this every morning and they put it on my hand and I tighten it up. And as I go through the hospital, I have very little function. That's what I got here. And that's all I got up there. And it's because I'm a central cord and most of my damage is in the upper. So what we did is she knew the, what I had and what my physical limitations were. So she made this so I could come up to pull up close to the ID, to the badge reader, and I put this up against it and it reads it and lets me in.
Fantastic. And so you also have another device that you were telling me the other day helps you access in the elevator.
Right. I was, when I first started working here, it was, everybody was here and I would go to the elevator and the elevators were so busy, I would just say, can you press 4? And, I'd get up to where I needed to go and back to where I needed to go because there were always people around. Well, I volunteered to work on a holiday. I can't remember which one it was. And there was nobody here. So the elevator was stayed open because it wasn't very busy. And I got on it and I wanted to go up to the 7th floor, I believe. And I got in there and I'm like, how the hell am I going to do this? And I got stuck in there for 30 minutes. So, because nobody was around. So the next day I went down, I told my occupational therapist what had happened. So they come up with this, it's a dowel, and on the end of it is a rubber piece. And then there's the handle. And I take my 2 fingers and it slides between my 2 fingers and I grip it. And when I come up to the elevator, I just push the buttons and that lets me in. So I went through probably, in 4 years, I probably went through 25 of these because I would lose them, I would drop them, and then I'd go back to get them, and they weren't there, and nobody turned them in and lost and found, so they just disappeared. So what they did is they tethered it. They put a hole in the bottom of it and tethered it to my chair, so if I drop it now, it just hangs there, and I can reach down and pick it up. The other issue we had with it is the pressure point on this is right here where I put my fingers in, and if you can see the bottom of it, that's the pressure point was always here, and it wouldn't last. It kept breaking. So Ursula Draper, who's the computer technology specialist here, happened to be down in the occupational therapy room when I was there, and I had gone in. I said, I need another stick. And Barb said, broke same place? I said, yes. And she said, well, what happened? What's going on? And we told Ursula, and she said, why don't you do a 3D printer? And we were like, duh. We didn't know anything about it. So she explained it to us, and she said, I think it was in South Carolina or North Carolina, they had one. We have an actual 3D printer here at the VA hospital, but we don't have an engineer, so we can't use it. So they sent it up there, the original stick that I had, and they made this piece right here, and now it's I believe it's a carbon fiber material, and it's unbreakable. It's lasted me, I can't even remember how long I've had it. So it's been successful. So what they're doing now is they're going to make the whole, because this was a wood dowel, they're going to make this whole piece now with a 3D printer. It's going to be made of the same material.
So it sounds to me like you are constantly going back to your team members for help and support to reconfigure and modify and improve so you can function on the job to the best of your ability.
I challenge them.
That's great.
I challenge them. I go in and I tell them an issue and I'll say, I need to take care of this, and they'll put their minds to it and they'll come up with it. This thing, I went to my occupational therapist and I told her the problem I was having, and she said, okay, let me think about it. And an hour later, she called me and she said, I need you to come down here and see if this will work for you, and put it on and work like a charm.
So there's a lot of ways that they support you continuing to work.
Yeah. The other, I have a thing on my leg. I don't know if you can see it. Because when I sit, my legs would go open like that, and my foot would keep falling off the chair. So they come up with, it's a strap, and it's made of a plastic that's molded, and then they took a seamstress took and stitched on the top of it a piece that fits over the molded plastic, and there's 2 pockets on each side, so I can put my credit cards and my money and all that in there. And then on the top of it is a big wide Velcro strip. So we took Velcro, we put that on the back of my phone, and it sits there so I have access to my phone all day.
Great.
And then the chair has a USB port, and I can plug it in and I can charge my phone all day off of that. So that's another thing that they did.
So
I kept breaking this. I kept breaking this because I run into the doorways and elevators. The elevators always jump out and get me. And they put a molded plastic piece over that because these are $700, these control panels, and I went through probably 8 of them. They said, oh, that's enough. So they put this, they made a molded plastic to protect it.
You and your team go through a lot of effort to make things right and modify things so you can continue to work.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, what do you get out of working?
I get pleasure. I get a purpose, that I have a purpose to get up every morning and go do something. I love my job here. I get to go around, I get to talk to the people and flirt with the nurses, and I stay busy all day because I'm constantly moving. I go up and I refill my box here, which is on my lap here. This is where we put the prescriptions or the medications, and I just like it. I like it. Days go so fast, and my days are full, and when I'm done, I felt like I've done something purposeful.
Well, I know that you have. Mr. Meyer, you've been nominated for Employee of the Year, correct?
Yes.
And you've been featured in some of the accolades that the James A. Haley likes to share, because some of you may remember that we experienced a hurricane last year, and this gentleman rode your chair because you were not able to get your usual transportation service. Is that correct? To the hospital, because people depend on you. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes, it is. So we appreciate the work that you do, and I'm glad that you're doing that. I could talk quite a bit with Mr. Myers, but I want to allow anyone else to ask questions as well.
Thank you both. This is Deb again. If we could go to the next slide, I think we'll open it up for questions of any of our speakers today. I see we have a few in our queue already. But if you do have a question, you can use the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. The first is probably for Denise. Can you share updates regarding WIOA as it pertains to state agencies supporting job seekers with disabilities? For positions with Ability One employment, is it a state-by-state regulation?
I'm not quite sure, but let me try and take, I'm not quite sure what the questioner is asking, but let me try and take a little bit of that. And the regulation itself, in terms of what WIOA requires, there's a federal regulation because WIOA is a federal law. And then there are federal regulations that say, that interpret that federal law. Then when you get to the state level, there are also some regulations that go beyond the federal ones to interpret it. In that case, it's state by state. So it kind of depends on what you're asking about. Certainly WIOA, the statute nationally, as well as the regulation, has to do with competitive integrated employment and the priority of competitive integrated employment. I think that's probably what the question is getting to. That part is in federal law and federal regulations. How that gets interpreted in the states, what each state does and provides under WIOA, that is more a state-by-state issue. I'd love to, if somebody wants to reach out to me again, they're more than welcome to. My email address is on the AUCD site, or it's drozell, ROZELL, @aucd.org. if you want to reach out to me separately. Back to you, Deb.
Thank you, Denise. So we also have a question for Tim. Did you receive other job counseling before getting into the promote?
No. No, I didn't.
Okay. I guess that was it for the question. And also we have a question about what efforts on both the federal and state level are reaching out to community businesses on the benefits of hiring individuals with disabilities. Is there a means to measure current hiring of individuals with disabilities by businesses? So that's a big question. I mean, the numbers that we provide each month give a sense for where hiring is going, whether it's up or down. There are many, many efforts at the state and federal levels and community levels to reach out to businesses on the benefits of hiring individuals with disabilities, AUCD, other advocacy groups, departments of vocational rehabilitation. Feel free to jump in, Denise. But
I think there's some other places too that you could go and look. The folks from what used to be, it's now called Disability IN, used to be the Business and Leadership Network. That's not right. USBLN, US Business and Leadership Network. Anyway, they do a lot of work in that arena. You can go look at LEAD, L-E-A-D. It's an ODEP program. They have some information up there. If you go to the ODEP website in the Department of Labor, they have a lot of information there. The ADA site in the Department of Justice also has some information, I believe, on outreach to businesses on accessibility issues under ADA. So there are a bunch of different places you can look.
I think that NGA report you mentioned too, Denise?
Yeah, absolutely. The NGA report I was talking about today has information about that. There's some of the previous things that we've talked about on the nTIDE reports. There's lots of information there as well. So there are a lot of people doing it. It doesn't mean we have solved that problem by any means. It doesn't mean that we have, the interviews that I was talking about today with HR directors, that's another one that's kind of interesting. There's a lot being done out there. I'm just not sure, we're just not there yet, but there's a lot of work with businesses going on. Okay, Deb, thanks.
Thanks, Denise. And I think this might be the last question we have time for Lisa. What's the best way to train rehab counselors on IPS?
When we were implementing in the trials, we used a variety of training mechanisms. We provided written material that oriented people to the field of spinal cord injury. We encouraged and facilitated the voc rehab counselors participating in team meetings and shadowing the other team members to learn about spinal cord injury. We also provided technical assistance and coaching on job development to the vocational providers through kind of creating a learning community of online conference calls that were supported by our coordinating center.
Thank you. So we also have a survey when our slides are posted on our website that you can complete for all of our viewers and let us know what you think about our webcasts. We'd like to thank our partners, Institute on Disability, where I work, Kessler Foundation, AUCD. We also have a second poll we're going to try. Art, if you can try to launch that again, great. It looks like it's working this time. So if you could let us know what section of the webcast you find the most interesting, the overview of the data, news from the field, guest panelists, interviewees, and the Q&A period, that would be great. Again, if you're on Facebook Live, you can click the chat icon and just type in your response. If you're watching by Zoom, you can just click a button and let us know which area you find most interesting. I'll give you half a minute to do so, and then Art, if you could share the results. Oh, it went away. Nope. Back again. Thanks for your patience. Are you seeing results, Art? Okay. If you could share them. That would be great. Okay, I see 12 out of 38 voted so far. And it looks like News from the Field is the winner again. Great job, Denise. But also our guest panelists and interviewees. Thank you all. So I'd like to thank you all for coming today. Are there any last comments anyone would like to make or last questions before we sign off?
I would just say, Deb, it's Denise. I would just say, don't forget to come back and tell us what kinds of things you want to hear. The first poll that we were talking about, we really are looking to plan next year, and we want to make sure we hit what you want to know about. So, and it will influence not just our guest panelists and our interviewees, but to some extent, that also helps me know what you want to hear from News in the Field too. So either, you know, put it in the chat box, send an email to one of us about what you want to learn about. That would really be helpful. So I put one more plug in for that.
And I'll put another plug to something Denise said before. Go out and vote next Tuesday. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
One more thing.